Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Mr. Saucedo's YouTube videos. Today we're going to be going over ATP, a little introduction at least, let's say. But how do living things store and use energy is the big question, right? So let's talk first about one of the characteristics of living things that we said back in Unit 1, all living things had, right? So all living things need to obtain and use energy. So they do it in different ways, but there is something that they all kind of have in common. The first, a group which you are definitely familiar with because you are one, are heterotrophs. So remember we talked about trophic levels? Troph or troph means consume, to eat, right? So heterotroph, hetero means different. So different eaters, meaning you eat things that are different, than you. And we get our energy by consuming other organisms. So, oh, that poor little guy isn't going to be there probably much longer. But these are heterotrophs, right? In fact, even this little baby gazelle is also a heterotroph because it doesn't consume, it consumes, plants in order to live, and plants are different than itself. Now, opposite of a heterotroph, autotrophs. Autotrophs are producers, right? So auto means self. So autotroph means self-feeding or self-feeder, right? And so those are organisms that make their own food by capturing sunlight or chemical energy. So a lot of times people forget that there are bacteria at the bottom of the ocean and stuff in these hydrothermal vents that are chemosynthetic, which means they use chemicals to make their energy, and they don't get their energy actually from the sun. But most autotrophs, most producers are, plants. So they get their, food from transforming transforming CO2 and water into glucose and oxygen. So, I'm getting ahead of myself. Most use photosynthesis, like it says, which is the process of using sunlight to convert CO2 and H2O into a form of energy. So, photo means light, synthesis means to put together. So, it's literally using light to put things together. And flowers, plants, flowering plants are good examples of autotrophs. So, what is the chemical that cells use? Since we're talking about, things that have cells, living things, what do they use to store their energy? Well, ATP is the magic word here, or I guess I should say the magic acronym, because ATP actually stands for adenosine triphosphate. And so it's a compound that quote unquote stores and quote unquote releases energy in cells, right? And it's not just our cells, it's plant cells, it's bacterial cells, it's all cells. But ATP stores and releases energy. And again, I'm using that in a generic way, let's say. Now, all food you eat must be converted to ATP before your cells can actually use it. So in reality, your cell, your cells that you have in your body are basically just gigantic manufacturing plants to turn food-related items into ATP so that, it's energized and can actually use the energy that you are consuming. So for example, let's say I got my double-double, I've got my fries, and I've got my drink. Your body's gonna have to break that apart and then turn it into this. It's gonna have to turn it into ATP. So the A part, adenine, that's where the sort of adeno part comes from. Triphosphate, tri means three, right? So we have three phosphates. That kind of makes sense. So what is ATP made of? ATP is made up of three parts. This is a generic way of kind of symbolically representing it, so you can draw that. But the A part is adenine, R is a ribose sugar, and each P is a phosphate group. Now, this little spring, let's say, is supposed to represent that the energy that is being stored and released is coming from the phosphate groups. How does ATP work? Well, the first phosphate bond breaks. So that little bond, those three little circles, the first phosphate bond breaks with very, very little activation energy. And remember that its activation energy determines how likely a reaction is to kind of occur. So this is the one we're talking about, by the way, when I say first phosphate, not the one that's attached to the ribose sugar. When it does that, energy is released, right? And the reason why this happens, though, is the product that is formed has stronger bonds. So this has stronger bonds than having that third phosphate there, which results in a net loss of energy, meaning that it is an exothermic process, meaning energy is being released as a result of that. Now, by losing a phosphate group, this resulting molecule is what we call ADP, adenosine diphosphate, di meaning two. So please label this and draw that. Now, ADP can be transformed and converted back into ATP with chemical energy. Sorry. Now, that chemical energy is found in the food you eat. And the enzyme that does that is called ATP synthase. Remember, what did we say? Enzymes end in ACE. And also, the first part tells you what it does. ATP synth. Synth meaning to manufacture. It literally means it's an enzyme that manufactures ATP. Go figure, right? So you can take this, put some food, phosphate comes back on. And that ATP synthase is what does that. So this is what ATP synthase looks like, and here is it kind of doing its job. So this is it transforming, or I guess I should say converting, ADP into ATP. All right. How much ATP can you make? Well, carbohydrates, sugars, right? Generally speaking, carbs are your most commonly, sourced energy device that your body uses anyway, right? Think about it. Most of the stuff that you probably consume has a bunch of carbohydrates in it or sugar in it already. So here are some carbs. You got fruit, you got grains, stuff like that. Pasta, I think's over here. So single sugar molecule like glucose makes about 36 ATP, which is quite a bit, by the way. Lipids, fats, lipids store about 80% of your calories. And a single fat, or in this case, we're talking about a triglyceride, makes about 146 ATP. Here's a lipocyte. Here's a vacuole that's basically filled with fat that you use for backup storage, basically, just in case you ever, don't have enough energy. And then what about our lovely proteins, right? We got proteins, you got nuts, fish, beans. Proteins are almost never broken down because your cells need them. Proteins are necessary building blocks. They make things, they transport things, they build stuff. Single proteins normally make between 10 to 30 ATPs, depending on the size of the protein. And that's basically it. That's our brief introduction to ATP. If you have any questions, let me know.